In the fall of 1973, in a dusty auction barn in southern Vermont, 25-year-old Clara Voss sat alone on a wooden plank, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The air was thick with the smells of damp hay, livestock, and the cheap cigars of men who believed they knew the value of everything. It had been less than a year since she had buried her husband, Daniel, and the weight of that silence was a constant companion, heavier than any physical burden the farm could place upon her. She was here today not as a spectator, but with a singular, desperate purpose that felt like a betrayal of common sense to everyone but her. Let me tell you about the men in that barn. They were pillars of the local agricultural community, men whose families had ranched sheep in these green hills for generations. They wore flannel shirts, worn denim, and faces carved by years of hard weather and harder markets. At the center of them, holding court without needing a throne, was Silas Sterling. He was a man whose wealth was as vast as his flock, a man who ran thousands of commercial-grade sheep on sprawling pastures. His hands were clean, his boots were polished, and his pronouncements on livestock were treated as gospel. He saw the world in terms of yield, profit margins, and efficiency. He did not see animals, he saw assets and liabilities. Then the pen gate creaked open, and the liability was brought forth. Lot 38. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a practiced rhythm, didn't even try to dress it up. All right, folks, what we have here is a dispersal lot. 38 ewes, mixed ages. As is, where is. Let's start the bidding at $1,000 for the lot. $1,000. Who'll give me $1,000? A wave of quiet, derisive laughter rippled through the crowd. It wasn't loud or boisterous, but the kind of low chuckle that is far more damning. The sheep were a pathetic sight. Their wool was matted and patchy, revealing ribs that stood out like ridges on a washboard. They were thin-boned and coughed with a wet, rattling sound that spoke of lungworm and neglect. Their eyes were dull, clouded with the resignation of animals that had given up. They huddled together, not out of flock instinct, but out of shared misery. To the assembled ranchers, they were not a flock. They were 38 individual death sentences, a veterinarian's bill wrapped in worthless fleece. They were fit only for the meat packer, and even that was a gamble. $1,000? Silas Sterling's voice boomed across the barn, dripping with theatrical disbelief. You'd have to pay me $1,000 to haul him away. More laughter, louder this time. The auctioneer, knowing a lost cause when he saw one, wiped his brow. Okay, I hear you. Tough crowd. Let's say 900. 900 for the lot? Silence. The only sound was the pathetic bleating of one of the ewes, a sound so weak it was swallowed by the cavernous space. Clara Voss did not move. Her face was a mask of calm, but inside, her heart hammered against her ribs. She was not seeing what the other men were seeing. She was seeing through Daniel's eyes. She remembered evenings spent at their kitchen table, a single lamp illuminating the pages of his flock journals. Daniel had been a different kind of farmer. He was a student of the land, a historian of the bloodlines. His journals were not mere records, they were manifestos of a forgotten way. He had inherited the farm from his grandfather, who had raised a heritage breed of sheep, a line almost lost to time, bred not for rapid growth on commercial feed but for hardiness in the harsh Vermont winters. They were bred for thrift, for their ability to thrive on rough pasture, for their innate resistance to the very ailments that plagued modern breeds, and for a deep, primal mothering instinct that ensured a high lamb survival rate without constant human intervention. Now, let me explain what Daniel had taught her. He had taught her to look past the surface. Anyone can see a fat sheep, Clara, he used to say, his hands gently parting the fleece of a prize ewe. Fat is easy. Look at the bones. Look at the set of the jaw, the width of the hips. Look at the eye. A good eye is clear and bright and intelligent. It knows you're there. He had taught her to recognize the specific traits of that old bloodline, a slight Roman nose that the modern breeder would cull for, a particular double coat with a fine, downy underlayer beneath a coarser guard fleece, and a blackish tint to the skin around the eyes and on the feet, what his grandfather called good hard black. These were not flaws. They were markers of resilience. The auctioneer's voice grew more desperate. $800 then. $800. Gentlemen, it's less than $22 a head. The men just shook their heads, turning to talk amongst themselves. The lot was a pariah. They were already moving on, thinking about the prize rams and healthy ewe lambs that would come up later. But Clara kept her eyes fixed on the pen. Beneath the matted wool and the gaunt frames, she saw it. On one ewe, the distinct shape of the jaw. On another, a glimpse of that good hard black on a hoof. On a third, even in its dullness, an eye that was shaped differently, more almond than round. They were sick, yes. They were neglected, absolutely. But they were not broken. They were Daniel's grandfather's sheep, or what was left of them, scattered and forgotten and now sold for scrap. $750. The auctioneer pleaded. Nothing. He sighed, ready to declare no sale. All right, last call. $700. $700 for the whole sorry lot. Going once. Clara's hand went up. It was not a hesitant gesture. It was a single, decisive motion. The barn, which had been buzzing with side conversations, fell utterly silent. Every head turned to stare at the young widow in the third row. The auctioneer blinked, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. I have $700 from the lady in the corner. $700. Do I hear $750? The silence was now thick with astonishment, which quickly curdled into pity. Silas Sterling turned his body fully around on the bench and looked directly at her. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was a mixture of contempt and disbelief. Son, he said to the younger man next to him, loud enough for the entire barn to hear, you are witnessing a fool and her money being parted. She's just bought herself a barn full of death. She'll be lucky to have a farm left to her name by the time the spring thaw comes. The auctioneer, eager to close the deal, didn't wait. $700 going once. Going twice. Sold for $700 to Clara Voss. The gavel cracked and the sound echoed like a gunshot. A few men shook their heads slowly, a gesture of sad finality. They had just watched Daniel Voss's widow throw away the last of her money. They had just watched her sign the death warrant for her own farm. Clara ignored them. She stood up, her back straight, and walked toward the clerk's office to pay the $700 that was nearly all the money she had left in the world. As she walked, she could feel Silas Sterling's eyes on her back, not with anger, but with the cold, dismissive certainty of a man who had already written her off. He was right about one thing. It was a gamble, but he was wrong about what she had bought. She hadn't bought sickness. She had bought a secret. She had bought a legacy. Getting them home was an ordeal in itself. The old farm truck, another legacy from Daniel, groaned under the strain. The ewes were too weak to jump, so she had to lift and guide each one up the ramp, their frail bodies feeling like little more than bones and wool. By the time she got them to the small, sheltered pasture behind her barn, the one Daniel had always called the hospital field, because of its rich clover and clean water source, it was nearly dark. She didn't put them with the half-dozen healthy sheep she already owned. Quarantine was the first rule in Daniel's journals. She stood by the fence for a long time, watching them. They didn't explore. They didn't graze. They just stood, shivering, their heads low. The enormity of her task settled upon her. Sterling's words echoed in her mind. A barn full of death. For a fleeting moment, a cold wave of doubt washed over her. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in? She was standing in the middle of that wager, and it looked grim. That night, she didn't sleep in her bed. She went into the study, the room that had been Daniel's sanctuary, and pulled his journals from the shelf. There were 5 of them, bound in dark green leather, filled with his precise, elegant script. She opened the first one. The pages smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco, and it was like he was in the room with her. She wasn't looking for sentiment. She was looking for a battle plan. The subsequent months were a masterclass in patience and grueling, solitary work. Her life fell into a rhythm dictated by the needs of the sick animals. Before the sun rose, she was in the barn, mixing a warm mash of oats, beet pulp, and molasses, laced with a specific mineral supplement Daniel had documented for restorative care. She had to feed many of them by hand at first, coaxing them to eat. She spent hours trimming matted, filth-caked wool from their bodies, cleaning sores, and applying salves made from recipes in the journal's herbal concoctions of comfrey and yarrow that the local vet would have scoffed at. She treated the lungworm not with the harsh, modern chemicals that could shock their fragile systems, but with a painstaking rotational grazing plan, moving the flock every 3 days to break the parasite's life cycle, a technique Daniel had sworn by. The land remembered the old ways, he used to say. The whispers in the community followed her everywhere. When she went to the general store for supplies, conversations would stop. The men who had been at the auction would nod curtly, their eyes filled with a sad pity that was worse than Sterling's open mockery. They saw her buying sacks of oats and minerals and knew she was just throwing good money after bad. "How are those new sheep of yours, Clara?" They'd ask, the question a thinly veiled accusation of foolishness. "They're coming along," she would reply, her voice even, offering no further detail. Her isolation was absolute. She was the town's cautionary tale, the young widow who had let grief cloud her judgment. There was a moment, deep in the heart of that first winter, that she nearly broke. A blizzard descended on the valley, burying the world in a silent, suffocating blanket of white. For 3 days, she was snowed in, cut off from everything. One of the oldest ewes, the one she had named Agnes, went into labor. The lamb was stuck. All through the night, in the freezing barn lit by a single kerosene lamp, Clara worked to save them both. The wind howled like a predator outside the walls. She was exhausted, her arms aching, her face numb with cold. Doubt, that cold and creeping vine, wrapped around her heart. Sterling was right. The men were right. This was impossible. She was alone, fighting a losing battle against nature itself. The ewe was weakening. Clara slumped against the pen wall, tears of frustration and despair freezing on her cheeks. She was going to lose them both. Then she remembered a specific entry in Daniel's journal. Volume 3, page 117. Breech birth, small ewe. He had described a similar situation and a specific technique his grandfather had used, a way of repositioning the lamb with gentle, patient pressure, working with the ewe's contractions, not against them. It was counterintuitive to everything modern practice taught. With a surge of renewed purpose, she went back to the struggling ewe. She spoke to her in a low, calm voice, her hands gentle. She followed Daniel's instructions, not as a desperate guess, but as an act of faith. An hour later, in the deep silence of the snowbound barn, a tiny steaming lamb slid out into the hay. It was small, but it was alive. The ewe, exhausted but alert, immediately began to lick it clean. In that moment, watching the primal, perfect bond between mother and newborn, Clara knew she would not fail. The journal was not a memory of her dead husband. It was a living tool. He was still with her. As winter began to recede, the first signs of success started to appear, subtle at first. The coughing stopped. The ewes began to fill out, their ribs disappearing under layers of fat and new, healthy fleece. The dullness in their eyes was replaced by a bright, curious alertness. When she walked into the pasture, they would now look up, their ears pricked forward. They were beginning to look like a proper flock. They grazed with purpose, and their wool, once a matted mess, was growing in thick and lustrous, with that telltale crimp and softness of the old breed. They were not just surviving, they were transforming. The land, her work, and their own resilient genetics were healing them from the inside out. Spring arrived, and with it the lambs. One by one, the ewes delivered. There were no complications, no breech births, no rejected lambs. The mothering instinct Daniel had prized so highly was powerfully evident. The ewes were attentive, fiercely protective, and produced ample milk. The lambs were born small, but they were vigorous. Within minutes of birth, they were on their feet, seeking the udder. They were little dynamos of energy, leaping and playing in the greening pasture. Clara had not lost a single ewe, and her lambing rate was 170%, with many of the older ewes successfully raising twins. Then, in late April, the news began to spread through the valley like a contagion. It was a respiratory virus, fast-moving and devastatingly effective against the popular commercial breeds that dominated the region. It struck the largest flocks the hardest, the ones like Silas Sterling's, where thousands of animals were kept in close proximity. The very efficiency that made him rich now made him vulnerable. The virus caused a high fever in pregnant ewes, leading to spontaneous abortions and stillbirths. The lambs that did survive were weak and sickly. The losses were catastrophic. Ranchers were losing half their lamb crop, some even more. The valley was in a state of panic. Vets were overwhelmed, and the modern medicines seemed to do little to stop the tide of the disease. Clara's farm, however, remained an island of tranquility. Her flock, isolated and fortified by their own hardy genetics, remained untouched. While her neighbors watched their profits and their year's work vanish, Clara watched her lambs grow strong and fat on their mother's milk. The contrast was stark and, for the first time, undeniable. Men who had driven past her farm for months, shaking their heads in pity, now slowed their trucks, their gazes lingering on the vibrant, healthy flock in her pasture. The whispers started again, but this time they were not of pity. They were of disbelief and burgeoning curiosity. One afternoon in early May, a polished pickup truck, one she recognized instantly, pulled into her long driveway. Silas Sterling got out. He did not walk with his usual confident swagger. His shoulders were slumped, and the lines on his face seemed deeper. He walked over to the fence of the hospital field, where the ewes and their boisterous lambs were grazing. He stood there for a long time, just watching. He saw what she had seen all along, but now it was no longer a theoretical possibility. It was a thriving, undeniable reality. The quality of the fleece, the solid conformation of the ewes, the sheer vigor of the lambs, it was all there. He turned as Clara approached, taking off his hat as a sign of respect he had certainly never shown her before. His eyes, for the first time, met hers directly, without a hint of condescension. They were the eyes of a defeated man. "I lost over 600 lambs," he said, his voice flat. "The ewes that didn't lose their babies are too weak to feed the ones that were born. It's a disaster." He gestured with his hat toward her flock. "Yours. They look like they've never had a sick day in their lives." "They haven't," Clara said simply. "Not since they got here, anyway." He stared at the sheep again, a look of profound confusion on his face. This defied everything he knew. This defied the entire modern system he had built his empire upon. Finally, he looked back at her, and he asked the question that had been burning in the minds of everyone in the valley. How did you know? They were culls. They were worthless. Now, let me stop and ask you something. When someone who has publicly mocked you comes to you in defeat, what is the temptation? It is to be smug. It is to say, "I told you so." It is to enjoy their humiliation. But Clara Voss was made of something finer than that. She looked at this powerful man, now humbled by a force of nature he couldn't control, and she gave him the simple, unvarnished truth. "My husband taught me what to look for," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "He learned from his grandfather. They never cared about how fast a sheep could grow. They cared about how well it could live. You saw sick animals. I saw good bones. You saw a loss. I saw a lineage." Sterling absorbed this, a slow understanding dawning in his eyes. He saw the years of accumulated wisdom he had dismissed in favor of spreadsheets and market trends. He had been playing checkers, while she, guided by the ghosts of the past, had been playing chess. He put his hat back on and made his move. "I'll buy them," he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its old command. "All of them. The ewes, the lambs. Name your price. I'll write you a check right now, before anyone else figures out what you've got here." It was the ultimate validation, the ultimate offer. He was trying to buy her secret, to absorb her success into his own failing operation. She could have named a price that would have set her up for life, that would have erased every doubt and every debt. The old Clara, the one who had walked into that auction barn with only $700 and a desperate hope, might have been tempted. But the woman who stood before him now was not the same. She had forged herself in the crucible of that winter, in the solitude of the barn, in the shared breath of a newborn lamb. She owned more than a flock of sheep. She owned herself. "They're not for sale, Mr. Sterling," she said. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a fact. He was stunned. "Not for sale? Everything is for sale, Mrs. Voss." "Not these," she repeated. "You can't buy a bloodline. You can only build one. And you can't buy what they taught me." He stood there, speechless for a moment. He, Silas Sterling, had been refused. But it was the way she did it, not with arrogance, but with a deep, unshakable certainty that finally broke through his pride. He looked at her, then at the flock, and then back at her. He nodded slowly. "I was wrong," he said. The words seemed to cost him a great deal. "That day at the auction, I spoke out of turn. I was wrong." He extended his hand. "You have my respect." Clara took his hand and shook it once, firmly. It was not the handshake of a subordinate, but of an equal. The story, of course, did not end there. A few months later, Clara entered a few of her best ewe lambs into the state breeding evaluation. It was an event attended by all the major ranchers and university experts. When her lambs were brought into the ring, there was a familiar murmur. They didn't look like the other lambs. They weren't as large as the commercial breeds, but their conformation was perfect. The judges, old men who remembered the sheep of their own grandfathers, fell silent. They examined the fleece, measuring the micron count and staple length. They checked the bone structure. They looked at the animal's teeth and eyes. When the final scores were announced, Clara's lambs swept every category for their class: fleece quality, conformation, and projected maternal traits. They were, the lead judge announced, a textbook example of what a hardy, dual-purpose sheep should be, a throwback to a time when resilience mattered more than size. The silence in that room was more profound than the laughter in the auction barn. It was the sound of an entire paradigm shifting. It was the sound of conventional wisdom breaking against the rock of forgotten knowledge. The next morning, A line of pickup trucks formed on the road leading to her farm. It was the same men who had laughed, the same men who had pitied her. They came not with mockery, but with checkbooks in their hands. They didn't want to buy her flock anymore. They wanted to buy her lambs. They wanted to buy her rams. They wanted to bring that resilience, that hardiness, that forgotten magic back into their own bloodlines. Clara Voss was no longer the foolish widow. She was the keeper of the flame. Let me tell you what happened over the next 30 years. Clara never became a massive operator like Silas Sterling. That was never her goal. She kept her flock small, manageable, and pure. But the Voss line lambs, as they came to be known, became the gold standard for breeding stock across the entire Northeast. She sold her breeding rams for more than what she had paid for that entire initial flock. She sold them only to farmers who understood their value and were committed to preserving the traits. She paid off the farm. She bought the adjoining 200 acres with cash. She built a new barn. She did it all slowly, patiently, and without a single dollar of debt. She became an elder, a woman whose quiet wisdom was sought out by university professors and young farmers alike. She would sit with them at her kitchen table, the same one where she had once studied Daniel's journals, and she would teach them. She taught them to look at the bones, to read the history in an animal's eye, to trust the land. She taught them that the best profits are not always the fastest, and that true wealth is not measured in numbers on a ledger, but in the health of the soil and the strength of the bloodline. Years later, when she was an old woman with grandchildren of her own, she would sometimes walk out to the hospital field. The original 38 ewes were long gone, but their descendants, great-great-granddaughters with the same good bones and bright eyes, grazed peacefully on the clover. She would take out the first of Daniel's journals, its leather cover now soft and worn with use. She would hand it to her oldest grandchild. The men at the auction had said she was buying a barn full of death. They believed they knew exactly what they were seeing. But what they saw was a fleeting sickness. What Clara saw was a timeless strength. They saw an ending. She saw a beginning. And in the quiet green hills of Vermont, the land and the sheep always remembered who was right.